The wooden floor of an old Texan homestead is crossed by the long shadows cast from the pale light of an oil lamp. Slowly, the camera pans across weathered furniture, daguerreotypes and tarnished frames, and a leather-bound journal whose pages have yellowed. In the vast expanse of the Texas frontier, through unforgiving terrain where the Rio Grande winds, there existed a family whose legacy defied the very laws of nature itself. The account of the Ironvale family is this: settlers whose dead refused to return to the earth from which all life springs. When Texas joined the Union in December of 1845, the promise of new beginnings drew many to its sprawling territories. Among them were the Ironvales, Ezekiel, his wife Martha, and their 5 children. The comforts of Tennessee had been left behind as they sought to carve out a life amidst the wild beauty of South Texas. Arduous had been the journey, taking nearly 3 months by wagon train. From the effort, their oxen had grown thin, and their supplies had dwindled to near nothing by the time the coastal plains of what would soon become their home were reached. Their homestead was established 15 miles west of the small settlement of Corpus Christi, on a stretch of land where the coastal plains gave way to rolling hills. Ezekiel, a former blacksmith with hands as strong as the iron he once forged, was determined to transform the cedar and mesquite-covered acres into fertile farmland. The scars of 20 years working the forge were borne on his forearms, small circular burns from flying sparks, and one long, jagged mark where a heated iron rod had slipped from his tongs during a violent thunderstorm that rattled the walls of his Tennessee workshop. The land they had chosen was not the most fertile in the region, but the price had been right, suspiciously so, as they would later discover. The previous owner, a nervous man from Boston who had acquired the deed through inheritance but never visited the property, had been eager to sell. Virgin land, he had assured Ezekiel through their correspondence, untouched, saved for the occasional hunting party of natives. What he failed to mention were the local legends about the area, whispers of strange lights seen hovering over certain stretches of ground, or the unexplained disappearance of a Spanish expedition nearly a century earlier. The arrival of the Ironvales coincided with mounting tensions between the United States and Mexico. The annexation of Texas had sparked a bitter dispute, and by May of 1846, President Polk had declared war. But for settlers like the Ironvales, far removed from political machinations, all their attention was demanded by daily survival. The first year on any frontier homestead determined whether a family would thrive or perish. And Ezekiel was determined that his family would put down roots to last for generations to come. Ezekiel Ironvale stood 6 foot 2 inches tall with a beard as dark as coal and eyes the color of stormy skies. From years of smithing, his hands were calloused. And even now, as he turned to farming, those hands remained strong enough to break a horse or fell a tree with seemingly little effort. A man of few words but deep conviction, the bedrock of his decisions was formed by his Presbyterian faith. His wife Martha was known for her skill with herbal remedies, a knowledge passed down through generations of her Cherokee ancestors. Her grandfather had been a respected medicine man in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. And though Martha had been raised in the Christian faith after her mother married a white settler, the teachings about plants and their healing properties she had never forgotten. Martha's complexion was several shades darker than her husband's. Her high cheekbones and straight black hair testified to her heritage. With a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the harsh conditions of frontier life, she moved. Yet her strength was evident in the unwavering gaze she fixed upon challenges. Their children, Joshua, Samuel, Rebecca, Elizabeth, and young Thomas, each bore the distinctive Ironvale features, high cheekbones, piercing eyes, and a peculiar birthmark resembling a crescent moon behind their right ears. Joshua, the eldest at 17, had inherited his father's height and strength, along with a thoughtful demeanor that made him seem older than his years. Samuel, 14, was smaller but quicker, with a mischievous streak that often led to good-natured trouble. The twins, Rebecca and Elizabeth, were 12, identical in appearance with their mother's dark eyes and graceful movements, yet distinct in temperament. Rebecca was bold and outspoken, while Elizabeth tended toward quiet observation, often seeming to notice things others missed. Thomas, the youngest at 7, was the light of the family. A reminder of the joy that could exist even in the hardship of frontier life was his infectious laughter and boundless energy. The family's humble cabin was built by Ezekiel's own hands with assistance from Joshua and Samuel. The structure was simple but sturdy, 2 rooms downstairs for living and cooking, with a loft above where the children slept on straw-filled mattresses. Dominating one wall was a stone fireplace, providing warmth during the surprisingly cold Texas winters and a cooking hearth for Martha's meals. The furniture was sparse but functional, a table and benches hewn from local oak, a rocking chair that Ezekiel had carried all the way from Tennessee as a gift for Martha, and storage chests that doubled as seating when neighbors visited, which was rare, given their remote location. The first indication that something was amiss with the Ironvales came not long after they had established their homestead. In August of 1846, during a particularly brutal summer drought, the family's hunting dog, Hector, succumbed to heat and age. The old hound had been with them for 11 years, having joined the family as a pup when Joshua was just 6. More than a hunting companion, Hector had been a protector, warning of approaching strangers, and a playmate for the children in their Tennessee home. His loss was felt keenly, especially by the younger children, who could scarcely remember a time before Hector had been part of their lives. Following frontier custom, Ezekiel dug a grave beneath a live oak tree near the edge of their property. The ground was hard from weeks without rain, and the effort left him drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to his broad back as he worked the stubborn Texas soil. The children gathered wildflowers, sparse and withered though they were in the drought, to place on the grave, while Martha sang a soft Cherokee morning song that her grandmother had taught her, a melody that seemed to hang in the still summer air long after her voice had fallen silent. 3 weeks later, a violent storm lashed the region, unearthing much of what had been buried, including Hector. Suddenly the rain came after months of drought, falling in sheets that turned the dusty ground to mud within minutes. The sky was split by lightning in jagged bursts, and thunder shook the small cabin to its foundation. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape, gullies where there had been level ground, debris scattered across the property, and the disturbing sight of Hector's grave partially collapsed, exposing the dog's remains. When Ezekiel went to rebury the dog, a discovery that would herald the beginning of the Ironvale mystery was made by him. Despite the passage of time and the merciless Texas heat, Hector's remains showed no signs of decomposition. The animal appeared as it had on the day it died, perfectly preserved, without decay or the stench of death. Beside the grave, Ezekiel knelt, mud soaking through the knees of his trousers as he examined the dog with growing disbelief. He had seen death many times on the frontier, animals and occasionally people, and knew the rapid progression of decay, especially in summer heat. Yet here was Hector, looking as if he might simply be sleeping. "Martha, come see this," he called, his voice steady despite the unease building within him. "It ain't natural." 3 weeks in the ground during the hottest days of summer, and Hector looks like he just passed yesterday. Cautiously, Martha approached, her long skirt gathered in one hand to keep it from dragging in the mud. She knelt beside her husband, her practiced healer's eyes assessing what lay before them. After a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice tinged with both wonder and concern. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Ezekiel. Perhaps it's best we don't question his designs." But question they did, for the preservation of Hector was merely the beginning. 2 months later, tragedy struck when 7-year-old Thomas fell from a horse while helping his brothers herd cattle. The autumn day had started like any other, breakfast of cornmeal mush and molasses, chores divided among family members, and the boys leading the small herd of cattle to a new grazing area a half-mile from the homestead. Thomas, eager to prove himself as capable as his older brothers, had begged to ride one of the horses rather than walk alongside. Joshua had finally relented, lifting the boy onto the gentlest of their 3 horses, a dappled mare named Daisy. What happened next occurred so quickly that Joshua would later struggle to recount the exact sequence of events. A rattlesnake, disturbed by the passing herd, had struck at Daisy's leg, causing the normally placid horse to rear in pain and surprise. Thomas, unprepared for the sudden movement, lost his grip and was thrown. The boy's neck broke instantly, killing him before his body hit the ground. Across the pasture echoed the sound, a sharp crack that would haunt Joshua's dreams for years to come, followed by a terrible stillness. Devastated by the loss of their youngest son, the Ironvales held a simple funeral in accordance with frontier traditions. A pine coffin was constructed, and Thomas was laid to rest in a small plot designated as the family cemetery. Martha insisted on wrapping the boy in a quilt she had made for his birth, unable to bear the thought of the cold earth touching her child's skin. The quilt was one of the few fine things they had brought from Tennessee, blue and white in a star pattern, with Thomas's name and birth date embroidered in one corner. As Ezekiel nailed the coffin shut, Martha placed her hand on the rough wood one final time, whispering a promise to her son that he would never be forgotten. The weeks that followed were marked by overwhelming grief, particularly for Martha, who would often sit beside Thomas's grave from sunrise until dusk, whispering prayers and Cherokee songs to guide his soul to the afterlife. The other children moved through their chores like shadows, speaking little and laughing not at all. Joshua, burdened by guilt, though his father assured him no blame was his to bear, worked from dawn until well past dark, as if physical exhaustion might grant him respite from his thoughts. In November of that year, as an early winter brought unseasonably cold temperatures to the region, Martha fell ill with pneumonia. The sickness came on suddenly, a cough that deepened over the course of a day, followed by a fever that left her shivering despite the blankets piled upon her bed. By nightfall, she was struggling to breathe, each inhalation a laboured rattle that filled the small cabin with dread. Despite Ezekiel's desperate attempts to secure a doctor from Corpus Christi, the harsh weather made travel impossible. Ice coated the trails, and the creek they would need to cross had frozen in treacherous sheets that would not bear the weight of a horse. The herbal remedies that Martha herself had taught him were prepared by Ezekiel, poultices of mustard seed for her chest, tea brewed from willow bark to reduce the fever, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. On the 3rd night of her illness, as the wind howled outside their cabin like a mourning wolf, Martha beckoned her husband close to her bedside. "Promise me you'll look after our children, Ezekiel," she whispered, her voice barely audible above her laboured breathing. "Promise me you won't let them forget their heritage, both yours and mine." Ezekiel took her hand, alarmed by the heat that radiated from her skin. "I promise, my love, but you'll recover. You must." Martha's smile was gentle but knowing, her dark eyes holding a wisdom that had always seemed ancient to him. "Some journeys cannot be avoided, my husband. I go to prepare a place for us all." Martha Ironvale died on November 14, 1846, leaving Ezekiel to raise their 4 remaining children alone on the unforgiving frontier. In his grief, Ezekiel made a decision that would later be viewed as the catalyst for all that followed. Rather than bury Martha immediately, as was customary due to the lack of embalming practices, he kept her body in their bedroom for 3 days, unable to part with the woman who had been his companion for 20 years. The children were forbidden to enter the room, though Elizabeth once crept to the doorway while her father was chopping wood, stealing a glimpse of her mother lying peacefully on the bed, surrounded by wildflowers gathered from the winter-brown fields. When Ezekiel finally surrendered to the inevitable and prepared to bury his wife, he was struck by a realization that sent chills through his body. Despite the passage of days without any preservation methods, Martha's body showed no signs of the changes that typically accompany death. Her skin remained warm to the touch, her limbs flexible, and her face as serene as if she were merely sleeping. For hours, Ezekiel sat beside her, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes were telling him. He had seen enough death to know this was not the natural order of things. "It cannot be," he whispered, running his calloused fingers across Martha's still supple hand. "What manner of blessing or curse is this?" Shaken but determined to provide Martha with a proper burial, Ezekiel placed her body in a coffin and interred her beside their son Thomas. That night he recorded his observations in a journal that would later become one of the few first-hand accounts of the Ironvale phenomenon. By the light of a single candle, his quill scratching across the page with an urgency born of confusion and wonder, he wrote. November 17, 1846. I have laid my beloved Martha to rest today, though rest seems an inappropriate word for what I witnessed. 3 days since her last breath, and yet her body defies the natural order. No odor, no discoloration, no stiffening of her limbs. I dare not speak of this to the children, for fear it would only deepen their sorrow. Is this a sign from the Almighty or something else entirely? I find myself both comforted and disturbed by the thought that even in death Martha remains unchanged. I recall now that Hector showed similar resistance to decay, though I attributed it then to the dry soil or some quirk of nature, but two such occurrences cannot be coincidence. There is something at work here beyond my understanding. The harsh winter of 1846 gave way to spring, and with it came renewed conflict with Mexico. The war that had seemed distant now encroached upon the frontier settlements of Texas. Reports reached Corpus Christi of Mexican troops moving north, and American soldiers became a common sight in town, their blue uniforms unpolished buttons standing in stark contrast to the rough homespun garments of the settlers. Ezekiel, determined to protect his remaining family, reinforced their homestead and kept his rifle loaded at all times. He taught Joshua and Samuel to shoot with greater precision, spending precious ammunition on target practice with cans placed on fence posts. The girls were instructed in reloading, their small fingers quickly becoming adept at measuring powder and seating bullets. In April of 1847, a band of raiders, whether Mexican soldiers or opportunistic bandits remains unclear from historical records, attacked the Ironvale homestead. The first warning came from their new dog, a young hound named Scout who had joined the family that winter. His frantic barking roused Ezekiel from sleep just before dawn, moments before the first shot splintered the cabin's shuttered windows. With practiced efficiency, Ezekiel moved, positioning Joshua at one window while he took up position at another. Samuel was tasked with reloading while Rebecca and Elizabeth huddled in the root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. The family fought bravely, but in the ensuing chaos, 14-year-old Samuel was struck by a stray bullet that found its way through a gap in the shutters. The boy had just handed a reloaded rifle to his father when the shot came, striking him in the chest with such force that he was thrown backward against the wall. Joshua's cry of alarm cut through the gunfire. "Father! Sam's been hit." Ezekiel glanced back, his heart seizing at the sight of his son crumpled on the floor, a dark stain spreading across his homespun shirt. Without hesitation, he shouted orders, his voice steady despite the terror gripping his heart. "Get him inside. Rebecca, Elizabeth, barricade the door." As Joshua dragged his brother toward the relative safety of the kitchen, Ezekiel provided covering fire, his shots methodical and precise. Whether it was his marksmanship or the raiders' realization that the homestead was well defended, the attack soon ceased. By the time the sun rose fully, casting golden light across the bullet-riddled cabin, the attackers had withdrawn, leaving behind 2 dead horses and a trail of blood suggesting at least one of their number had been wounded. The victory, if it could be called such, was hollow. Despite their efforts, Samuel died before dawn. The bullet had pierced his lung, and though Martha might have known how to treat such a wound, Ezekiel's knowledge of healing was limited to setting bones and stitching simple cuts. As his son's breathing grew increasingly labored, Ezekiel could do nothing but hold the boy's hand, murmuring prayers and assurances that soon proved empty. As Ezekiel prepared to bury his son beside Martha and Thomas, he was once again confronted with the inexplicable preservation that had manifested with his wife's passing. Samuel's fatal wound had ceased bleeding, but otherwise his body remained unchanged by death. The pallor that typically follows the departure of life was absent, and when Ezekiel reluctantly tested the boy's limbs, he found no sign of rigor mortis despite the passage of hours. It was then that Ezekiel began to suspect that something extraordinary, and perhaps unnatural, was happening to his family. He delayed Samuel's burial by a day, then another, watching for any sign of the decay that inevitably claims all mortal flesh. None appeared. In the privacy of the tool shed, away from the grieving eyes of his remaining children, Ezekiel examined his son's body with methodical care, documenting his observations in the journal that was becoming his sole confidant. April 9, 1847. 3 days have passed since Samuel left this world, and like Martha before him, his body refuses to yield to death's corruption. I have examined him closely and found no explanation for this phenomenon. The bullet wound that took his life remains visible but shows no sign of putrefaction. Is it possible that our bloodline carries some protection against the ravages of time? Or is this land somehow preserving us even after death? I have heard tales of strange occurrences in these territories, but nothing like this. I fear what it might mean for us all. The Cherokee believed in places where the veil between worlds grows thin, sacred grounds where the dead might linger. Could we have unknowingly settled on such a place? Martha would have recognized the signs. Perhaps without her wisdom, I am left to my own imperfect understanding. Finally, Ezekiel buried Samuel alongside Martha and Thomas. The two remaining children, Joshua and the twins Rebecca and Elizabeth, had witnessed enough to understand that something unusual was happening to their family. The secret of the Ironvales had begun to take shape, though they dared not speak of it to outsiders. As they stood around the fresh grave, the spring breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the small cemetery, Joshua voiced the question that had been forming in his mind. "Father, why doesn't Sam look like the miller's boy did when he died last year? The millers had to bury him right away because..." Ezekiel's response was swift and stern, his eyes flashing with a warning that silenced his eldest son mid-sentence. "We do not speak of such things, Joshua. What happens in our family stays within our family. Do you understand?" Joshua nodded, his gaze dropping to the freshly turned earth. Beside him, the twins exchanged glances, a wordless communication that had been their habit since infancy. Elizabeth's expression was thoughtful, almost curious, while Rebecca's showed only fear. None of them spoke again as they walked back to the cabin, the weight of unasked questions hanging between them like an invisible shroud. As the Mexican-American War continued to ravage the borderlands, the Ironvales withdrew further into isolation. Ezekiel, once known for his willingness to assist neighbors with blacksmithing needs, now turned away visitors with curt explanations about the demands of the farm. In truth, he feared what might happen if others discovered their secret. The frontier was rife with superstition, and he had seen how quickly fear could turn to violence among men isolated from civilization's restraints. When the Patterson family, settlers whose land joined the Ironvale property to the south, came seeking help with a broken wagon axle, a repair that would have taken Ezekiel less than a day in his former life as a blacksmith, he refused them at the property line, his rifle not quite pointed at them, but visibly present in his hands. "I've got no time for smithing these days," he explained, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "There's a wheelwright in Corpus Christi who can help you." James Patterson, a stocky man with a sunburned face and honest eyes, frowned at the uncharacteristic refusal. It's a 2-day journey to town with a broken axle, Ezekiel. We've always been good neighbors to each other. Times change, Ezekiel replied, his gaze darting briefly toward the family cemetery, visible on a small rise behind him. War's coming closer. Every man needs to look after his own now. The Pattersons left without further argument. But James's wife Sarah later remarked to her sister in a letter that has survived in the Texas State Archives, "The Ironvale place has a darkness about it now." Ezekiel, once the most helpful man in the county, stands at his property line like a sentinel guarding a fortress. The children are rarely seen, and when they are, they move like ghosts, pale and silent. Something has changed in that family beyond the natural grief of losing a wife and 2 sons. I find myself crossing to the other side of the trail when I must pass their land, though I cannot say precisely what it is I fear. The summer of 1847 brought more tragedy to the Ironvale homestead. A rattlesnake bite claimed Rebecca as she collected eggs from the family's chicken coop. The girl had always been the more adventurous of the twins, less cautious than her sister when it came to exploring the darker corners of the farm buildings. On this particular morning, she had reached into a nest without first checking for danger, her mind perhaps distracted by the song she had been humming, one of her mother's Cherokee lullabies that the girls had continued to sing to each other since Martha's death. The snake struck quickly, its fangs sinking into Rebecca's wrist before she could withdraw her hand. Her scream brought Elizabeth running from the garden where she had been gathering vegetables for the midday meal. The sight that greeted her was one that would haunt her dreams for years to come, her twin convulsing on the ground, foam flecking her lips, the unmistakable puncture marks on her wrist already swelling and turning an angry purple. "Father! Joshua! Come quickly! Rebecca won't wake up!" Elizabeth's cries echoed across the homestead, her voice rising to a pitch that spoke of pure terror. By the time Ezekiel reached the chicken coop, Rebecca was beyond saving. The twin puncture marks on her ankle and the telltale swelling confirmed what had happened. Though he applied a tourniquet and attempted to draw out the venom as Martha had once taught him, the poison had already spread too far. Rebecca died in her father's arms, her final words a whispered plea to her twin, "Don't forget me, Lizzie. Promise you won't forget me." As with Martha and Samuel before her, Rebecca's body showed no signs of decomposition in the days following her death. Ezekiel, no longer surprised but still troubled by the phenomenon, kept her body in the cabin for 2 days before burial, allowing Elizabeth time to sit with her twin and say the lengthy goodbyes that their sudden separation had denied them. During those 2 days, Elizabeth rarely left Rebecca's side, whispering secrets and promises that no one else could hear, brushing her sister's hair with the pearl-handled brush that had been a shared 12th birthday gift from their mother. When at last Rebecca was laid to rest in the family cemetery, now occupied by half of the Ironvale family, Ezekiel added another entry to his increasingly detailed journal. July 16, 1847. Rebecca joins Martha, Thomas, and Samuel in our small plot of earth today. Like them, she shows no sign that death has touched her beyond the stillness of her chest and the absence of light in her eyes. For members of my family have now exhibited this same resistance to nature's course. It cannot be coincidence, nor can it be attributed to any preservation techniques, for I have applied none. The phenomenon affects our blood alone. When our mule died this spring, Decay claimed her as it would any creature. Yet my family remains untouched. I cannot decide if this is divine mercy or something far more troubling. Elizabeth asked me today if Rebecca would ever truly leave us. I had no answer that would bring her comfort. Elizabeth, devastated by the loss of her twin, fell into a deep melancholy. She refused to eat, spending hours at Rebecca's graveside, talking to her deceased sister as if she could still hear. Ezekiel and Joshua watched helplessly as Elizabeth's grief consumed her. The girl who had once been thoughtful and observant now seemed to exist in a world between life and death, her body present but her mind elsewhere. Often they would find her sitting by Rebecca's grave, her lips moving in conversation, though no sound emerged. "I know you can hear me, Becca," she whispered during one such vigil, unaware that Joshua had followed her to the cemetery out of concern. "You're still here, aren't you? Not like other dead folk. You're different. We're all different." Joshua, reporting this conversation to his father later that evening, couldn't mask his worry. "She's not well, Father. It's not natural, the way she talks to Rebecca as if she's still here. And sometimes I think she's talking to Mother and Thomas and Samuel, too." Ezekiel, who had been cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table, paused, his hands growing still on the weapon. "Your sister is grieving, Joshua. We all find our own ways to bear such burdens. But what if it's more than that?" Joshua persisted, lowering his voice, though Elizabeth was outside once again at the cemetery despite the approaching dusk. "What if she knows something about what happens to our family when we die?" The sharp look Ezekiel gave his son would have silenced a less determined young man. But Joshua had grown in both stature and resolve since assuming the role of his father's right hand. At 18, he now stood as tall as Ezekiel, his shoulders broadened by farm work and his mind sharpened by responsibility. "I've seen them, too, Father," Joshua continued, meeting his father's gaze steadily. "I've seen how they don't change after death. I'm not a child anymore. If there's something happening to our family, I have a right to know." After a long moment of tense silence, Ezekiel set aside the rifle and gestured for Joshua to sit. "There are things in this world that defy explanation, son. Your mother would say it's the land itself, that we've settled on ground that the Cherokee would have recognized as sacred. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that our dead don't decay as others do. Beyond that—" He shook his head. "Beyond that, I have only questions, not answers." In his growing obsession to understand the phenomenon affecting his family, Ezekiel began conducting experiments that would later horrify those who discovered his journals. He exhumed the body of Thomas, buried nearly a year prior, and found the child completely preserved. The quilt Martha had wrapped him in was still vibrant with color. The preservation extended not just to the body, but to everything in direct contact with it. The quilt showed no sign of mildew or rot, and a small wooden toy horse placed in the coffin remained as polished as the day it was buried. Ezekiel recorded his findings with scientific precision, his handwriting growing increasingly cramped as he filled page after page with observations and theories. His journal entries from this period reveal a man walking the narrow line between scientific inquiry and madness, driven by a desperate need to understand what was happening to his family. July 18, 1847. "I have done what no father should ever do, disturbing my boy's rest to confirm my suspicions. 10 months in the earth, and Thomas looks as he did the day we laid him down. His skin remains supple, his hair still soft to the touch. The phenomenon affects not just the recently deceased, but persists through time. What does it mean? Are we blessed with eternal preservation, or is this a curse that denies our dead their natural return to dust? I covered him once more and returned him to his grave, begging forgiveness for my transgression. Yet, even as I whispered my apologies, I found myself making mental notes of further tests I might conduct. God help me. I cannot stop until I understand." As 1847 drew to a close, rumors began to circulate in Corpus Christi about the strange Ironvale family who buried their dead but never seemed to mourn for long. Some attributed it to frontier hardness, the necessity of moving forward in the face of constant danger. Others whispered of unholy practices and forbidden knowledge. The Ironvale's increasing isolation only fueled such speculation. And when Joshua made his monthly trip into town for supplies, he found himself the subject of sidelong glances and hushed conversations that ceased as soon as he approached. In the general store, where Joshua had once been greeted warmly as the son of a respected settler, he now encountered a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. As he gathered the items on his father's list, coffee, ammunition, salt, and the writing paper that Ezekiel now consumed at an alarming rate, he overheard a conversation between the shopkeeper and another customer that made his blood run cold. "There's that Ironvale boy," muttered a heavyset farmer whom Joshua recognized as Timothy Walsh, whose property lay about 5 miles east of their homestead. "Third death in their family this year. And they say old Ezekiel didn't shed a tear at the daughter's funeral. Unnatural, I tell you." The shopkeeper, Henry Miller, whose own son had died the previous year from fever, glanced uncomfortably at Joshua before responding in a lower voice that nevertheless carried in the quiet store. "Quiet now. The boy can hear you. Besides, who are we to judge how others bear their grief?" Walsh snorted, making no effort to lower his voice further. "It's not just grief I'm talking about. My wife visited their place after the mother died, bringing food like women do, you know. Says Ezekiel wouldn't let her pass the porch. Wouldn't even open the door all the way. And she swears she saw the dead woman laid out in the back room 3 days after she'd passed. No embalming, no ice, nothing to keep her in this heat. Should have been." He made a graphic gesture that left his meaning unmistakable. Joshua completed his purchases in rigid silence, aware of the eyes following him as he loaded the supplies into his wagon. The journey home was a blur, his mind racing with implications. The family secret was no longer entirely secret, it seemed. And if suspicion was already taking root in town, how long before it blossomed into something more dangerous? By early 1848, with the war with Mexico concluding and settlers returning to their normal lives, Ezekiel had formulated a theory about his family's condition. He believed that the land they had chosen for their homestead, once sacred to indigenous peoples, had somehow affected their bloodline. Martha's Cherokee heritage, he reasoned, might have created a bridge between their family and ancient powers residing in the earth. Ezekiel's journal entries from this period reveal a man consumed by his search for answers, spending long nights poring over his wife's few books on Cherokee traditions and experimenting with soil samples from different areas of their property. His handwriting, once neat and measured, grew increasingly erratic, with passages crossed out and rewritten, margins filled with additional observations, and entire pages covered in diagrams mapping the locations of deaths and burials on their land. February 3, 1848. I have been studying Martha's grandmother's teachings, which she recorded in her own journals. There are references to sacred grounds where the veil between worlds grows thin, places where the dead may linger if proper rituals are observed. Could it be that we unknowingly settled upon such a place? That Martha's blood recognized the power in this soil and bound our family to it? I find myself both terrified and fascinated by the possibility. Last night, I took soil samples from the cemetery and from the farthest corner of our property. Under my magnifying glass, the cemetery soil appears darker, with a peculiar iridescence when held to lamplight, that the other sample lacks. Tomorrow, I will test whether this soil affects dead matter from beyond our family. While Ezekiel pursued his theories, 16-year-old Joshua shouldered the burden of maintaining the farm and caring for his increasingly unstable sister. Elizabeth, now 15, had taken to collecting dead animals, birds, rabbits, even insects, and placing them in carefully constructed shrines throughout the property. These macabre displays, crafted from twigs, stones, and scraps of fabric, began appearing in the barn, in hollow trees, and once, to Joshua's horror, beneath his own bed. Each contained a perfectly preserved specimen, often adorned with wildflowers or small trinkets that had belonged to her deceased siblings. When Joshua discovered Elizabeth arranging a newly dead sparrow in a nest of hair he recognized with a chill as having been cut from Rebecca's head before burial, he confronted her, his concern overcoming his reluctance to acknowledge the strangeness that had enveloped their lives. "Lizzie, you need to stop this," he said, gently but firmly, taking the bird from her hands. "What if someone from town sees these things you're making?" Elizabeth looked up at her brother with eyes that seemed older than her 15 years, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm just testing Father's theory, Joshua. See? This sparrow died 3 weeks ago, but it hasn't changed at all. And this rabbit has been dead since Christmas. Don't you think they're beautiful? Death can't touch us, Joshua." "Not really." The serene certainty in her voice chilled Joshua more than any hysteria might have. It was as though Elizabeth had accepted, even embraced, whatever strange power had taken hold of their family. As if sensing his discomfort, she reached out to touch his hand, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the spring day. "Rebecca talks to me, you know," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She says there's no pain where they are, just waiting. They are all waiting for us, Joshua. One by one, we'll join them, and then the circle will be complete." Joshua, increasingly concerned for his sister's mental state and the isolation in which they lived, began making secret plans to leave the homestead. He had heard of opportunities in California, where gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill, and dreamed of a life free from the shadow that had fallen over the Ironvale name. In the privacy of his loft bedroom, he carefully set aside a portion of the money earned from selling their crops, along with essential supplies, jerky, hardtack, an extra knife, and the small pistol that had been a gift from his father on his 16th birthday. These treasures he wrapped in oilcloth and hid beneath a loose floorboard, his ticket to a new beginning, far from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the Ironvale homestead. Yet even as he planned his escape, Joshua found himself reluctant to abandon Elizabeth to whatever fate awaited the remaining Ironvales. Some nights, lying awake listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, he considered taking her with him, dragging her away from this place by force if necessary, before the strange preservation that claimed their dead could claim her spirit as well. But Elizabeth's connection to the homestead and to the family cemetery, where half of their family now lay, seemed unbreakable. On the one occasion when Joshua had cautiously suggested they might seek a fresh start elsewhere, his sister had looked at him with such betrayal that he had immediately retracted the suggestion. "This is where we belong," she had said with quiet conviction. "This land chose us, Joshua. We can't leave. None of us can, not really." In April of 1848, Ezekiel's obsession reached a breaking point. Convinced that he needed to understand the full extent of the preservation phenomenon, he exhumed all 4 family graves to examine the bodies. The act itself took an entire day, and Joshua, returning from Corpus Christi where he had been finalizing arrangements to join a wagon train heading west the following week, discovered his father replacing the soil on the family graves. The confrontation that followed would change the course of the Ironvale legacy forever. "Father, what have you done?" Joshua's voice cracked with horror as he took in the scene, 4 open graves, the disturbed earth, and his father's wild-eyed appearance. Ezekiel's clothes were caked with soil, his hands raw from digging, and a feverish light burned in his eyes that Joshua had never seen before. Ezekiel straightened, leaning on his shovel as he regarded his son with an expression that hovered between defensiveness and evangelical zeal. "I needed to understand, Joshua. You don't see the importance of what's happening to our family. This is beyond anything recorded in scientific or theological texts. We are preserved, Joshua. Even in death, we endure." Joshua dismounted from his horse, approaching his father with the caution one might use when nearing a wounded animal. "They are dead, Father. Let them rest in peace. This is desecration, not research. Mother would be ashamed. The mention of Martha seemed to strike Ezekiel like a physical blow. For a moment, grief and clarity warred in his expression, then his face hardened, the momentary vulnerability replaced by righteous indignation. Your mother would understand the significance of what I've discovered. The Cherokee always honored their ancestors, kept them close. What we've been given is a gift, Joshua. A way to keep our family together, even after death has taken them from us. Joshua shook his head, taking another step closer. No, Father. What you're doing isn't honoring them. It's unnatural. We need help. I'm going to ride into town tomorrow and bring back Reverend Thatcher. He can help us make sense of this. The argument escalated rapidly, with Ezekiel growing increasingly agitated as Joshua threatened to expose his actions to the authorities in Corpus Christi. The prospect of outsiders invading their sanctuary, examining the bodies of his wife and children, drove Ezekiel to a frenzy of protective rage. You'll do no such thing, he roared, advancing on his son with the shovel gripped tightly in his hands. This is family business, boy. Not for strangers to gawk at and misunderstand. I forbid it. Joshua stood his ground, matching his father's intensity, if not his madness. I'm not a boy anymore, Father. I can't stand by while you lose yourself to this obsession. It ends now. Either you agree to seek help, or I'll bring it here myself. In his rage and fear, Ezekiel struck his son with the shovel, the same tool he had used to exhume his family's remains. The metal edge caught Joshua on the temple with a dull thud that seemed to echo across the cemetery. Joshua's expression registered surprise rather than pain as he crumpled to the ground, blood trickling from the wound to stain the disturbed earth beneath him. Joshua Ironvale died instantly from the blow to his head. As the reality of what he had done dawned on Ezekiel, he fell to his knees beside his son's body, overwhelming grief replacing the manic energy that had driven him moments before. The shovel fell from his nerveless fingers as he gathered Joshua into his arms, rocking back and forth as sobs tore from his throat. No, no, not you, too. What have I done, Joshua? My boy, forgive me. Elizabeth, witnessing the death of her brother from the window of the farmhouse, did not scream or run. Instead, she watched with an eerie calmness as her father carried Joshua's body inside and laid it on the dining table, the same table where, over the past 2 years, 4 other family members had been prepared for burial. As twilight deepened into night, she approached the table where her father sat vigil, his large hand smoothing Joshua's hair away from the fatal wound, as if the gentle gesture might somehow undo the damage. He was going to leave us, Elizabeth said softly, startling her father, who had not heard her enter. I found his pack hidden beneath the floorboards in the loft. Money, food, his pistol. He was abandoning us, Father. Ezekiel looked up at his daughter, his face haggard with grief and guilt. That doesn't justify what I've done, Elizabeth. I've killed my own son. Elizabeth shook her head, a small, enigmatic smile playing at her lips. No, you've kept him with us. Like the others. He won't decay, Father. He won't leave. None of them ever really leaves us. In the days that followed, Ezekiel's grip on reality deteriorated completely. He refused to bury Joshua, instead keeping the body in the house as he conducted various tests to document the preservation process from its earliest stages. Elizabeth, seemingly unmoved by her brother's death, assisted her father in his macabre experiments. Together they recorded changes, or rather, the lack thereof, in Joshua's body, noting with clinical detachment that the wound which had taken his life showed no signs of infection or decay, that his limbs remained flexible, and that his features retained the appearance of life, save for the stillness of his chest. Ezekiel's journal entries from this period reveal a mind untethered from conventional morality, driven by a terrible combination of scientific curiosity and grief-induced madness. His handwriting sprawls across the pages, sometimes nearly illegible in his haste to record his observations. April 17, 1848. 5 days since Joshua's passing. No rigor mortis, no discoloration, no odor of decay. The wound that took his life has congealed but shows no sign of putrefaction. Elizabeth has been most helpful in documenting our observations. She understands the significance of our family's condition in ways I never expected. She says that Joshua speaks to her in dreams, as do Martha and the others. They are waiting for us, she says, waiting in a place where time stands still. I find myself envying Elizabeth's connection to them. Though I strain my ears in the night, I hear nothing but the wind and the occasional coyote. Why do they speak to her and not to me? Is it her youth, her innocence despite all she has witnessed? Or is it Martha's blood running stronger in her veins? Tomorrow we will conduct a new experiment, placing one of Joshua's hands in soil from the far corner of our property while leaving the other untouched. If my theory about the sacred ground is correct, we should see decay begin in the hand surrounded by common earth. By May of 1848, the isolation and tragedy that had befallen the Ironvale family had attracted the attention of neighboring settlers. When Joshua failed to appear in Corpus Christi for his regular supply runs, questions began to arise. The young man had been a fixture in town, known for his reliability and the quiet dignity with which he had shouldered his family's successive tragedies. His absence was noted first by the shopkeeper Henry Miller, who had come to respect Joshua despite the rumors surrounding his family. After 3 weeks without word from the Ironvales, Miller's concern overcame his reluctance to interfere in a family that had made it clear they wished to be left alone. He approached James Patterson, whose property adjoined the Ironvale homestead, and together they recruited 2 other men from the settlement, the blacksmith who had taken over much of Ezekiel's former business, and a young deputy newly appointed to assist the aging sheriff. The 4 set out on horseback, telling themselves they were merely checking on neighbors after the spring storms, though each carried a firearm and harbored private misgivings about what they might find. As they approached the Ironvale property, the signs of neglect were immediately apparent. Fields that should have been planted with corn and cotton lay fallow, overrun with weeds. The cattle that had once grazed in neat pastures had broken through unmended fences and wandered freely across the property. The homestead itself, once a model of frontier efficiency despite its simplicity, now bore the unmistakable marks of abandonment, a partially collapsed roof on the barn, shutters hanging askew from windows, and an eerie silence unbroken by the sounds of daily life that should have emanated from a working farm. Ezekiel. Joshua. Anyone home? We've come to check on you folks, Miller called out as they neared the cabin, his voice carrying in the still air of the spring afternoon. No response came from the darkened structure, though smoke rose thinly from the chimney, suggesting that someone remained in residence. The men exchanged glances, their unease growing. After a moment's hesitation, Miller dismounted and approached the cabin, the others following his lead. The door, when he pushed it open, was unlocked, unusual for a frontier home where security was a constant concern. The scene that greeted them as they entered would become the stuff of Texas legend for generations to come. Ezekiel and Elizabeth sat at the dining table, apparently sharing a meal with Joshua's preserved corpse propped up in a chair across from them. The body, now nearly a month dead, showed no sign of decay. The fatal wound at his temple was clean and bloodless, as if it had happened moments rather than weeks before. Joshua's eyes had been closed, his hands folded neatly in his lap, and he had been dressed in his Sunday best, a white shirt and black trousers that had previously been worn only for church services or funerals. Ezekiel looked up at the intruders with mild surprise rather than alarm, as if unexpected dinner guests had arrived rather than horrified neighbors. Elizabeth continued to eat, seemingly unbothered by the interruption, occasionally glancing at Joshua's body with a soft smile, as if sharing a private joke. Good Lord Almighty! The blacksmith, a burly man named Anderson who had seen his share of death on the frontier, stumbled backward at the sight, crossing himself reflexively though he was not a Catholic. Miller, frozen in the doorway, found his voice after a moment of stunned silence. "Get the sheriff." Now, he ordered the deputy, who needed no further encouragement to retreat from the macabre tableau. But the most shocking discovery came when the men, acting on a suspicion born of the unnatural preservation of Joshua's body, investigated the small family cemetery on the property. All 5 graves had been opened, the coffins arranged in a circle at the center of the plot. Inside each coffin lay a perfectly preserved body, Martha, serene as if sleeping despite the 17 months since her death, Thomas, the child's face peaceful beneath a crown of wildflowers placed on his brow, Samuel, the fatal bullet wound in his chest as clean as the day it was inflicted, Rebecca, a small smile curving her lips as if she were having a pleasant dream, and a space clearly intended for Joshua, marked by a coffin lid inscribed with his name and the date of his death. The men stood in horrified silence, the full extent of the Ironvale's aberration laid bare before them. It was Anderson who finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've heard tales of body snatchers back east, grave robbers who sell corpses to medical schools, but this is something else entirely." "It's not body snatching," Patterson replied, his face ashen. "These are his own family. And look at them. They should be gone by now, especially the wife and the youngest boy, but they look like they died yesterday." Ezekiel, confronted by the settlers, showed no remorse or awareness that his actions were abhorrent. Instead, he invited them to witness what he called the miracle of the Ironvale bloodline, the inexplicable preservation of his family's remains. His manner was that of a proud collector displaying prized possessions, or a scientist presenting evidence of a revolutionary discovery. "You see," he said, gesturing toward the open coffins with a sweep of his arm, "death has no dominion over us. We remain as we were, untouched by corruption. It's the land, you understand. This sacred ground has claimed us as its own." The evangelical fervor in his voice made the hair on the back of Miller's neck stand on end. He had known Ezekiel Ironvale for 2 years, had respected him as a hard-working settler, a devoted family man, and a skilled craftsman. The transformation from that man to the wild-eyed figure before him was as disturbing as the unnatural preservation of the bodies themselves. Elizabeth, equally detached from reality, spoke of conversations with her dead siblings and mother, claiming that they were waiting for her and her father to join them in a place beyond the Vale of Tears. Her voice had the sing-song quality of a child reciting a beloved nursery rhyme, at odds with the ghastly nature of her words. "They are not really gone. None of them. They are just waiting for us to complete the family circle. Father understands. Soon we'll all be together again." The settlers, horrified by what they had discovered, forcibly removed Ezekiel and Elizabeth from the property. The local sheriff placed them under arrest, though no specific charges existed for their particular transgression. Grave desecration was the closest applicable offense, though it hardly seemed to encompass the extent of what had occurred at the Ironvale homestead. The community, unsure how to process what had been uncovered, quickly labeled Ezekiel insane and Elizabeth his unfortunate victim. It was a more comfortable explanation than confronting the inexplicable preservation of the Ironvale dead, or the implications of Elizabeth's serene complicity in her father's madness. Madness, after all, was a known quantity, disturbing, but comprehensible in a way that bodies refusing to decay for years after death were not. The bodies of the Ironvale family were reinterred in the local cemetery in Corpus Christi, each in a separate plot to honor what the community saw as Ezekiel's desecration of his family's remains. Curiously, historical records indicate that the presiding minister insisted on special preparations for the bodies, including packed lime and other substances typically used to hasten decomposition. Whether this was done out of practical concerns about public health or a more superstitious fear of the Ironvale phenomenon spreading to other graves remains a matter of historical debate. The funeral was attended by nearly the entire settlement of Corpus Christi, drawn as much by morbid curiosity as by Christian charity. Many who had known the Ironvales in life stood awkwardly at the graveside, unsure how to reconcile their memories of a respectable frontier family with the horror that had been discovered on their homestead. Prayers were offered for the repose of the dead, but also, in hushed tones at the edge of the cemetery, for protection against whatever unnatural force had preserved their bodies. Ezekiel Ironvale was committed to the Texas State Lunatic Asylum in Austin, where he died in 1851, reportedly from self-inflicted starvation. His body, according to asylum records, was buried in an unmarked grave on the asylum grounds, a decision made deliberately to separate him from his family in death as the community had separated them in life. The asylum journal recording his final days notes that Ezekiel refused all food for 2 weeks before his death, explaining to his keepers that, "I must join them on empty ground, untainted by the power that holds them. Only then can we truly rest together." Elizabeth, deemed too young for such a fate, was placed in the care of a minister's family in San Antonio. Reverend Thatcher and his wife Sarah had no children of their own, and despite the disturbing circumstances of Elizabeth's orphaning, they approached her guardianship with genuine compassion. Initial reports suggest that Elizabeth adapted well to her new surroundings, showing no signs of the madness that had claimed her father. She attended the local school, joined the church choir, and to all outward appearances, seemed to be recovering from the trauma of her past. Yet those closest to her noted certain peculiarities that never quite faded: her habit of collecting dead butterflies and pressing them between the pages of her Bible, her tendency to speak to empty chairs as if conversing with unseen companions, and her serene insistence, when questioned directly about her family, that they were waiting, not gone. The Thatchers, God-fearing people who believed in redemption, attributed these oddities to the natural after-effects of profound grief and isolation and continued to raise Elizabeth as their own. Here, conventional historical records regarding the Ironvale family might have ended, were it not for a series of unusual incidents that followed over the subsequent decades. In 1855, during the expansion of Corpus Christi Cemetery, workers exhuming bodies for relocation made a disturbing discovery. The remains of Martha, Thomas, Samuel, Rebecca, and Joshua Ironvale, buried 7 years earlier, showed no signs of decomposition. Despite the lime and other substances applied during burial, despite the years spent in the ground, the bodies remained as they had been in life, save for the stillness of death. The cemetery workers, most of whom had lived in the area long enough to remember the scandal of the Ironvale homestead, reacted with understandable horror. One man, Diego Ramirez, whose testimony was recorded by a local historian, described the discovery in vivid terms. "Mother of God, it's like they were buried yesterday. Not a mark of decay on any of them. The woman, she had been dead 9 years by then. Her skin was still soft when I touched it. May the saints forgive me for the sacrilege. The children, too, perfect as sleeping angels. It was not natural. My father would have called it brujeria, witchcraft. But even the brujas of old Mexico could not preserve the dead like this." Alarmed by their discovery and the rumors that still circulated about the ill-fated Ironvale family, the cemetery workers reinterred the bodies in deeper graves, adding additional lime and other substances believed to accelerate decomposition. The incident was documented by the cemetery caretaker but largely kept from public knowledge to prevent panic. The official record, preserved in the church archives of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Corpus Christi, makes only a brief reference to anomalous preservation requiring special treatment, with a note that the bodies were reinterred in the northwestern corner of the cemetery at a depth of 8 feet rather than the customary 6. In 1863, during the Civil War, when resources were diverted to the conflict and record-keeping became sporadic, Elizabeth Ironvale disappeared from the minister's home in San Antonio. She was 30 years old and had lived quietly as the minister's adopted daughter, showing no signs of the madness that had gripped her father. The Thatchers, by then elderly and in poor health, reported her missing to the local authorities. But with the war raging across Texas, a missing woman was far from the highest priority. The only clue to her disappearance was a note left on her bed, written in the elegant script that Reverend Thatcher had taught her during their first year together. The note, preserved in the Texas State Archives as part of the Ironvale Anomaly collection, reads simply, "They are calling me home. The circle must be completed. Forgiveness waits in the sacred ground. I thank you for your kindness, but family ties cannot be severed, not even by death. Do not seek me. By the time you read these words, I will be where I belong." Searches for Elizabeth proved fruitless, and with the chaos of war engulfing Texas, her disappearance soon faded from priority. Reverend Thatcher, in a letter to his brother in Virginia dated December 1863, expressed his belief that Elizabeth had returned to the original Ironvale homestead, drawn by some connection to her family that neither time nor distance had managed to sever. "I fear," he wrote, "that the strangeness that claimed her father has finally emerged in her as well. We provided all the love and guidance we could, but there was always something in her eyes, a faraway look, as if she were listening to voices we could not hear. May God have mercy on her soul, wherever she may be." It would be another 5 years before the final chapter of the Ironvale story began to unfold, bringing together the scattered threads of the family's strange legacy into a pattern that defied rational explanation, yet could not be dismissed as mere frontier legend. In 1868, a cattle rancher named Jeremiah Caldwell purchased the land that had once belonged to the Ironvale family. The original homestead had fallen into disrepair, and local superstition had kept the property vacant for 20 years. The cabin roof had partially collapsed, vines and undergrowth had reclaimed the fields, and the family cemetery had become overgrown with mesquite and cedar, the wooden crosses marking the original graves long since rotted away. Caldwell, a pragmatic man with no patience for ghost stories, saw only good grazing land at a bargain price. Having arrived in Texas after the Ironvale tragedy, he knew of it only as a vague local legend, one of many tall tales told around campfires or in the saloons of Corpus Christi when the night grew late and the whiskey flowed freely. Nonsense, all of it, he declared to the land agent who warned him of the property's history. Dead is dead, and land is land. I don't care who lived here before, or what tales the old-timers spin. This soil will feed my cattle just fine. Caldwell demolished the remaining structures of the Ironvale home and erected a new ranch house a quarter-mile away, deliberately avoiding the site of the family cemetery. This decision was based less on superstition than on practical considerations. The original home site was prone to flooding during heavy rains, while his chosen location offered better drainage and a commanding view of the surrounding pastures. For several months the ranch prospered, with Caldwell reporting no unusual occurrences. His herd grew fat on the lush grass that seemed to grow more abundantly here than on neighboring properties, and the wells he dug produced water that was sweet and plentiful even in dry spells. If anything, Caldwell considered himself fortunate to have purchased land that others avoided due to unfounded fears, securing prime grazing territory at a fraction of its true value. In early 1869, however, Caldwell's ranch hands began to report strange sightings, a woman in outdated dress walking among the cattle at dusk, children's laughter echoing from the old cemetery site, and most disturbing, the figure of a tall man standing at the edge of the property, watching the ranch house with an unwavering gaze. These apparitions were glimpsed only briefly, always in the transitional hours of dawn or dusk, and never when directly approached. Miguel Vasquez, a vaquero with years of experience on the Texas range, was the first to bring such a sighting to Caldwell's attention. A man not given to flights of fancy or superstition, Vasquez's matter-of-fact report carried weight that gossip from more impressionable hands might not have. "I seen her again, Mr. Caldwell," he reported one morning, his expression troubled beneath the brim of his weathered hat. "That same woman walking through the north pasture like she's looking for something. When I rode out to check, there weren't no tracks in the mud, not even where I saw her standing plain as day." Caldwell, irritated by what he perceived as childish fears threatening to disrupt his operation, dismissed the report with a wave of his hand. "You've been listening to those stories in town. There's nothing out there but cattle and coyotes. Keep your mind on your work." Yet as the sightings continued and several ranch hands quit in fear, Caldwell's skepticism began to waver. Objects in the ranch house moved without explanation, tools left in one location would be found in another, doors locked at night stood open in the morning, and on one memorable occasion, every piece of silverware in the kitchen was discovered arranged in a perfect circle on the dining room table, though Caldwell lived alone and had locked the house securely before riding out to check the herd. In April of 1869, exactly 21 years after Ezekiel Ironvale killed his son Joshua, Caldwell witnessed something that challenged his understanding of the natural world. Returning from Corpus Christi, where he had been arranging the sale of a portion of his herd, he took a shortcut across his property that passed near the overgrown Ironvale cemetery. The night was clear, a full moon illuminating the landscape in silver light that transformed the familiar terrain into something otherworldly. As he crested a small rise, Caldwell saw them, a procession of figures moving with deliberate purpose toward the cemetery. A woman led the way, her long skirt brushing the tops of the spring wildflowers, followed by 3 children of varying ages, then a young man, and finally, at the rear, a tall man with a dark beard. They carried no lanterns, yet seemed to glow with an inner light that illuminated their path through the darkness. Caldwell's horse, normally steady even during thunderstorms, refused to approach the procession, snorting and backing away despite his urging. From a distance, Caldwell watched as the figures gathered around the overgrown cemetery. The woman knelt and appeared to be searching the ground, her movements those of someone looking for a specific marker or sign. The children, 2 girls who might have been twins and a small boy, stood in a semicircle around her, while the young man and the bearded figure remained slightly apart, as if standing guard. Then, as if sensing Caldwell's presence, the tall man turned and looked directly at him. Despite the considerable distance between them, Caldwell felt the weight of that gaze as tangibly as a hand upon his shoulder. The man's eyes held no malice, only a profound sadness and something like relief. He raised his hand, not in threat, but in acknowledgement, before turning back to join the others. By the time Caldwell gathered his courage and approached the spot, they had vanished, leaving no trace of their passing, no footprints in the soft spring earth, no bent stalks of grass to mark their path, nothing to suggest that 6 figures had stood there moments before. Only the lingering scent of wildflowers and a strange metallic tang in the air, like the aftermath of a lightning strike, suggested anything out of the ordinary had occurred. That night, Caldwell recorded his experience in his personal journal, a leather-bound volume in which he typically noted nothing more significant than cattle sales and weather patterns. His hand trembled as he wrote, not from fear, but from the profound sense that he had witnessed something beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. April 12, 1869. I write this with a hand that trembles not from fear, but from the knowledge that I have witnessed something beyond explanation. Tonight, as I rode back from town, I saw them. A procession of figures moving across my land toward the old Ironvale cemetery. A woman leading, followed by 3 children of varying ages, then a young man, and finally, at the rear, a tall man with a dark beard. They carried no lanterns, yet seemed to glow with an inner light that illuminated their path. When my horse refused to go closer, I watched from a distance as they gathered around the overgrown cemetery. The woman knelt and appeared to be searching the ground. Then, as if sensing my presence, the tall man turned and looked directly at me. His eyes, they held no malice, only a profound sadness and something like relief. He raised his hand, not in threat, but in acknowledgement, before turning back to join the others. By the time I gathered my courage and approached the spot, they had vanished, leaving no trace of their passing. Disturbed by his experience, Caldwell sought information about the Ironvale family, eventually tracking down the journal of Ezekiel Ironvale, which had been preserved in the records of the Texas State Lunatic Asylum. What he read convinced him that something unnatural had occurred on his property, something that continued to echo through time. The detailed accounts of the preserved bodies, the theories about sacred ground, and the final descent into madness painted a picture far more complex than the simple ghost story he had dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Driven by a combination of curiosity and mounting unease, Caldwell made a decision that would provide the final piece of the Ironvale mystery. He hired workers to excavate the old family cemetery, determined to discover if the legends about the non-decaying bodies were true. Most of the local men refused the work regardless of the wage offered, but Caldwell eventually secured the services of 3 Mexican laborers newly arrived in the area, men who had not grown up hearing the whispers about the Ironvale homestead and its unnatural legacy. What they found defied explanation. There were 6 graves in the Ironvale cemetery, the 5 original family members, and a 6th, more recent burial. In this grave, they discovered the perfectly preserved body of Elizabeth Ironvale, apparently dead for several years, yet showing no signs of decomposition. She was dressed in a simple white dress, her hands folded over her chest, and her expression one of profound peace. Clutched in her hands was a journal, its pages filled with an account of her return to the family homestead in 1863 and her patient wait for the completion of the circle. The journal, partially damaged by moisture but still largely legible, revealed that Elizabeth had returned to the original homestead 6 years earlier, drawn by dreams in which her deceased family members called to her. Living in the ruins of the family cabin, surviving on wild game and vegetables grown in a small garden plot, she had spent months searching for the exact location of the original family cemetery, which had been obscured by years of neglect and natural growth. August 17, 1863. I have returned to our sacred ground after 15 years of exile. The voices of my family guided me home, growing stronger with each mile that brought me closer to this place. Our house stands empty, but the land remembers us. I have cleared the graves of my mother, brothers, and sister, and prepared my own resting place beside them. Now I wait for Father to find his way back to us. The circle remains incomplete until we are all gathered here, preserved in death as we could never be in life, a family undivided by time or decay. Further excavation revealed that beneath Elizabeth's grave lay another, unmarked burial, the remains of Ezekiel Ironvale, somehow transported from his asylum grave in Austin to the family plot. Like the others, his body showed no sign of the decomposition that should have claimed it years before. How his remains had made the journey of nearly 200 miles was a mystery that Elizabeth's journal did not explicitly solve, though one entry hinted at a possible explanation. September 3, 1863. I dreamt of Father last night. He was in a dark place surrounded by strangers, his body wasting away but his spirit strong. He told me to prepare his place in the circle, that when his mortal form finally failed him, the land would draw him home, as it has drawn all of us. I do not understand how this can be, but I have learned not to question the mysteries of our condition. The land knows its own. The workers, confronted with the inexplicable preservation of 6 bodies spanning more than 20 years of death, reacted with predictable horror. One man fled immediately, not even staying to collect his pay. The other two crossed themselves repeatedly as they continued the work, refusing to touch the bodies directly and speaking only in hushed whispers as if afraid of waking the dead. "This can't be," one worker said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind through the mesquite trees. "The man died in Austin nearly 20 years ago. How did he get here? And why does he look like he died yesterday?" Caldwell, stunned by the discovery, found himself contemplating Elizabeth's journal entries with a growing sense that he had stumbled upon something far beyond normal human experience. "The circle," she wrote about. "Completing the circle. They are all here now, the entire family together in death as they couldn't be in life." Caldwell, deeply shaken by the discovery, ordered the graves to be filled in and the area fenced off. He documented everything he had found, including Elizabeth's journal, and sealed the documents in a metal box that he buried beneath the floorboards of his ranch house. In his own journal, Caldwell wrote what would become the final first-hand account of the Ironvale phenomenon. April 20, 1869. "I have reinterred the Ironvales where they wish to rest, together on the land that somehow bound them in both life and death. I cannot explain what power preserves their mortal remains, defying the natural order that returns all flesh to dust. Is it a blessing or a curse, a miracle or an abomination? I cannot say, but I know this: they have found a peace in death that eluded them in life. The procession I witnessed was their spirits finally united, acknowledging that the circle is complete. I will not disturb them again, nor will I speak of what I have seen. Some mysteries are not meant to be unraveled by mortal minds." True to his word, Jeremiah Caldwell never spoke publicly about the Ironvales. He continued to run his ranch until his death in 1892, though local rumor held that he never again set foot near the old family cemetery. The land prospered under his care, his cattle fetching premium prices at market due to their exceptional health and size. Some attributed this success to Caldwell's innovative breeding practices, others to the inherent fertility of the soil. Only Caldwell knew that each spring he would leave a portion of his first hay cutting at the edge of the fenced cemetery, a gesture of respect, or perhaps appeasement, to whatever force dwelled there. The metal box containing his records and Elizabeth's journal remained hidden beneath the floorboards of the ranch house until 1937, when a fire destroyed the structure. Workers clearing the ruins discovered the partially melted box and its contents, bringing the Ironvale story back into the light after nearly 70 years. By then, Corpus Christi had grown into a modern city, and the land once owned by the Ironvales and later by Caldwell had been parceled and sold for development. The discovery prompted a historical investigation. But when researchers attempted to locate the Ironvale cemetery to exhume the bodies for scientific study, they found that accurate records of its location had been lost. Caldwell's fence had long since rotted away, and the landscape had changed significantly through decades of ranching and development. What had once been open pasture was now subdivided into residential plots, with modern homes standing where the Ironvales had once farmed and where they had been laid to rest. What became of the preserved bodies of the Ironvale family remains unknown. Some believe they were secretly removed by government officials and stored in an undisclosed location for study. Others suggest that descendants of Jeremiah Caldwell, honoring his wish to leave the family at peace, deliberately obscured the cemetery's location. A third theory, popular among those with an interest in the paranormal, holds that the bodies finally decayed once the circle was complete, their purpose, whatever it might have been, fulfilled by the reunion of the entire family on the land that had somehow claimed them. Perhaps the most intriguing theory comes from a 1952 account by a construction worker involved in building a housing development near the presumed location of the Ironvale property. He claimed to have uncovered a set of perfectly preserved human remains while excavating for a foundation. Before he could report the discovery, the bodies reportedly turned to dust upon exposure to air, as if all the years of decay they had somehow avoided suddenly caught up in a single moment. 1 minute, I'm looking at what could have been a person who died yesterday, the worker recalled in a newspaper interview that was never published due to the editor's concerns about credibility. The next, there's nothing but dust blowing away in the wind, like whatever magic was preserving them just gave up. I didn't report it. Who'd believe me? And besides, it seemed right somehow, them returning to dust like the good book says we all should. Unnatural, the way they'd been preserved, like they'd been waiting for something. And once it happened, they could finally rest. Whether this account represents the final chapter of the Ironvale story or merely another layer of legend is impossible to determine. The family's journals, preserved in the Texas State Archives, provide tantalizing glimpses into their lives and the inexplicable phenomenon that defied natural law. But many questions remain unanswered. How did Ezekiel's body travel from Austin to the family cemetery? What power preserved the Ironvale dead from decay for decades? Was it, as Ezekiel theorized, something in the land itself, or was Martha's Cherokee heritage somehow connected to their unusual condition? Scholars have proposed various scientific explanations for the phenomenon, from unique soil chemistry that might have created natural mummification conditions to unknown embalming practices Martha might have learned from her Cherokee ancestors. Others point to the psychological aspects of the story, suggesting that grief and isolation drove the Ironvales to imagine preservation where there was only normal decay, their perceptions distorted by the trauma of successive losses in a harsh frontier environment. Yet no theory fully accounts for the consistent reports across decades from multiple, unrelated witnesses, all describing the same inexplicable preservation. From Ezekiel's detailed journal entries to the cemetery workers' discovery in 1855 to Caldwell's findings in 1869, the evidence suggests something beyond current scientific understanding occurred on that plot of Texas soil. The Ironvale mystery stands as a reminder that even in an age of scientific enlightenment, some aspects of death and what may lie beyond remain beyond our comprehension. Today, in the suburbs of Corpus Christi, residents occasionally report strange sightings, a family of 6 walking in procession at dusk, disappearing when approached. Some claim to have seen a woman in 19th century dress tending to plants in their gardens, or heard children's laughter in empty rooms. Most eerily, some new homeowners report finding small arrangements of perfectly preserved dead insects or flowers hidden in attics or behind walls, reminiscent of Elizabeth Ironvale's disturbing shrines. The land remembers, it seems, even when human records fail. And perhaps somewhere beneath the foundations of modern Texas, the Ironvales remain as they were in life and in death, a family bound by blood to each other and to the soil that refused to reclaim them. Their story persists not just as a frontier legend or a ghost tale told to frighten children, but as a mystery that touches on our deepest questions about life, death, and what may lie between. The story of the Ironvale family serves as a chilling reminder that some mysteries of our mortal existence defy explanation. What force preserved their earthly remains? Was it a blessing that kept them together even in death? Or a curse that denied them proper passage to whatever lies beyond? We may never know. But perhaps if you find yourself in the coastal plains of South Texas, and glimpse a family walking at dusk, a tall man with a dark beard, a woman with Cherokee features, and 4 children of varying ages, it might be wise to let them pass undisturbed. The circle is complete, and some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed.